and welcome to today's lecture on the Second Intermediate Period. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to take a look at what happens when the classical age of art and literature in Egypt begins to fall apart. Now, we've already seen this happen once, at the end of the Old Kingdom, but we'll see an entirely different set of circumstances at play this time around. Instead of rising regional powers like we saw at the end of the Old Kingdom, this time foreign invasion will play a key role in the breakdown of royal hegemony. So whether you're trying to fight off an invading army, or you're looking for advice about a successful conquest, journey with me as we investigate the Second Intermediate Period. The Middle Kingdom in Egypt began with the reunification of Egypt by Mentuhotep II around 2050 BCE. It ended about 400 years later, around 1650 BCE, with the last king of the 13th dynasty. In between, ancient Egypt experienced a time of flourishing, where art and literature and culture reached a level that some would argue wouldn't be reached again for the next millennium and a half. And rulers seem to have learned from the mistakes of the Old Kingdom. The mighty Senusret III disbanded nomarchs altogether in an attempt to prevent the regional fragmentation that occurred during the First Intermediate Period. So how did it fall apart? Well, one of the major factors is the rapid turnover of royal kingship. With the mighty Senusret III, we have a king ruling almost 20 years, and his son Amenemhat III ruled an impressive 45 years. But things began to wane after that, and the last king of the 12th dynasty, Sobek-Nefru, ruled for only 5 years. Oh, and that king was a woman! This is actually either the first or second example of a female being pharaoh, depending on which Egyptologist you ask. But don't blame the collapse of the Middle Kingdom on her. It was the 13th dynasty that really botched it. According to Manetho, the 13th dynasty had something like 60 rulers over the course of about 150 years. And with that sort of rapid turnover, it's nearly impossible to maintain stability across a country. And Egypt became vulnerable both to internal regional uprisings and external invasion. This began with the rise of a Levantine family from the modern area of Israel or Palestine, at the site of Avaris in the Egyptian Delta. So we can tell they're from that region because of their Semitic names. And shortly before 1700 BCE, they named their leader the King of Egypt. And that started the 14th dynasty. So now we've got the weak, chaotic 13th dynasty doing battle with the upstart Semitic 14th dynasty. And while all this is going on, a new player, the Hixos, literally rolls into town on the first war chariots Egypt has ever seen. Sometime around 1650 BCE, a group of people from Canaan, the modern area of Israel or Palestine, swooped down south and west into the Egyptian Delta region. These people were called the Hixos. At least that's what the Greeks called them, based on a corruption of the Egyptian term. And they represent one of the most successful external invasions of Egypt up until this point. So how did they do it? How did a small group of people from Canaan overthrow the mighty Egyptian civilization into complete disarray?
Well, there are two main hypotheses as to how this actually happened. The more recent hypothesis is that this was a gradual migration more than an intense invasion. We already saw that another Semitic group of people had declared themselves kings at Avaris to start the 14th dynasty. And this could be representative of a larger trend of people from the Levant area making their way into Egypt. And as the Hyksos entered Egypt, they walked into a landscape that was already weakened and at war, and they kind of gradually grew to take over political power.
The other hypothesis is far more violent. Some scholars believe that this group of Semitic people swept down into Egypt, bringing with them a new set of military technology that the Egyptians just weren't prepared for. The Hyksos brought with them horses and war chariots, the first introduction of both of these things into Egypt. And they had a far greater speed and mobility on the battlefield because of these technologies. And they could fight from afar. The Hyksos also introduced the composite bow and the recurve bow into Egypt, allowing for arrows to be shot faster and further than they ever had before. They also brought with them new swords and shields and metal armor and helmets. All ended up being too much for the Egyptians at the time.
So regardless of which hypothesis is correct, it's safe to say that the Hyksos were successful. They took over Egypt around 1650 BCE, starting the 15th dynasty in the Second Intermediate Period. And they had a relatively small number of long-lived rulers over the course of their 100-year hegemony over Egypt.
We saw that at the height of the Middle Kingdom, the Egyptian pharaoh Senusret III had driven deep into Nubia. After winning battles in at least 4 separate expeditions, he set up a series of massive forts, formalizing the border between Egypt and Nubia and controlling trade and movement between populations. And at the time, this worked quite well. Both Egypt and Nubia seemed to have prospered with this trade, and Nubia even adopted many Egyptian customs, especially in the realm of religion.
So, side note here, right? The region we're talking about is in the modern-day country of Sudan. The ancient Egyptians called that region Nubia, from the Egyptian word nub, which meant gold, and it kind of gives you a good idea of what they were after when they went there. The people of that region called themselves Cushites, after the kingdom of Cush. So I'll use the word Cush and Nubia interchangeably, but I'm talking about the same place located in the modern country of Sudan. Anyway, everything began to fall apart in the 13th dynasty when the Egyptian royal power weakened. Pharaohs stopped supporting the forts, and people who were there didn't even get recalled to Egypt proper. They just made the forts their new home.
With the forts no longer supported, the Nubians began to grow in strength, politically and economically and militarily. They'd adopted much of Egyptian culture, and this, in turn, had made them a more formidable force than they had previously been. They built temples and cities and trading posts, and eventually they began to portray themselves as kings in the Egyptian style.
Eventually, an uneasy truce emerged between the major players at the time. Thebes was once again growing in power in Upper Egypt, and had proclaimed the start of the 16th dynasty there. The Hyksos, or the 15th dynasty, was ruling from Lower Egypt in the north. And now the Nubians were portraying themselves as Egyptian kings too. and all three groups traded amongst each other, maintaining this kind of delicate balance that was soon to break.
So what do we make of the Second Intermediate Period? Once again, there's no simple answer. It's all a matter of perspective. Early scholars described this as a time of chaos and collapse at the hands of the Hyksos. But more recently, scholars have noted that this may be true for the political elite of Egypt, but for regional aristocracy and the regular people of Egypt, the political shuffling of the Second Intermediate Period could be as much about opportunity as it was about collapse.
So we've already seen some major technological advances during the time of the Hyksos. The war chariot, for example, had never before been used in Egypt. And although it was currently being used to destroy the Egyptians, New Kingdom rulers, centuries later, would adopt this technology to strengthen their own military. Similarly, they introduced the composite bow, made of a combination of horns and wood and sinew. And this allowed for greater power in a compact, smaller weapon.
A stela set up by Kamose, the last king of Thebes prior to the reunification of Upper and Lower Egypt, describes the Hyksos as follows. "Behold, I come a successful man. What remains is in my possession, and my venture prospers. As mighty Amun endures, I shall not leave you. I shall not allow you to tread the fields even when I am not here with you. Does your heart fail, O you vile Asiatic? Look, I drink of the wine of your vineyards, which the Asiatics whom I captured pressed out for me. I have smashed up your rest house. I have cut down your trees. I have forced your women into ships' holds. I have seized your horses. I haven't left a plank to the hundreds of ships of fresh cedar which have filled with gold, lapis, silver, turquoise, bronze axes without number. Over and above the moringa oil, incense, fat, honey, willow, boxwood, sticks, and all their fine woods, all the fine products of the Levant. I have confiscated all of it."
One of the problems that exists for accurately interpreting the Second Intermediate Period is that nearly all the texts are Egyptian, like the one we just read. And what that means is that everything we learn about the Hyksos from the literary record comes from an antagonistic Egyptian perspective. Even then, however, we can see that the wealth of material culture the Hyksos brought with them, right? So we have gold, lapis, silver, turquoise, bronze axes without number. Not doing too bad for a series of foreign kings.
During the Second Intermediate Period, we have a complex political ecology. The Hyksos are ruling from the site of Avaris in the north in Lower Egypt. Egyptian rulers are starting to gain power once again at the site of Thebes in the south in Upper Egypt. And the Nubian rulers continue to exert serious influence even further south. Soon, it would erupt into all-out warfare.
Now, the way this actually happened is pretty crazy. A later papyrus from the New Kingdom recounts that the leader of the Hyksos, Apepi of Avaris, sent the leader of Thebes, Sekenenre-Tao, saying, "Do away with the hippopotamus pool, which is on the east of the city, for they prevent me from sleeping at night." But Sekenenre-Tao was not going to get rid of his beloved pool of hippos. Instead, he saw this as an insult, and he marched his army north and attacked Apepi and the city of Avaris.
Unfortunately, for Sekenenre-Tao, that didn't end well. He probably should have just gotten rid of the hippopotamuses. We know from later writers that he attacked the Hyksos, and we know from his mummy how that turned out. Severe wounds to the head caused by several battle axe strikes indicated that he died in battle. Now remember that this is the Theban king himself who caught a battle axe upside the head. These were tumultuous times indeed.
Second Enretao's successor was Kamose of Thebes. Despite the gruesome end of his predecessor, Kamose continued the battle against the Hixos. According to an inscription he set up, his goal was once again to have an Egyptian ruler rule Egypt. His inscription reads, "One chief is in Avaris, another in Cush, and I sit here associated with an Asiatic and Nubian. Each man has his slice in this Egypt, and so the land is partitioned with me. See, he even has Hermopolis. No one can be at ease when they are milked by the taxes of the Asiatics. I shall grapple with him that I might crush his belly for my desire to rescue Egypt, which the Asiatics have utterly destroyed." Eventually, Kamose's brother Ahmose finished the battle, defeated the Hyksos, and became the first ruler of the 18th dynasty and what we call the New Kingdom. An Egyptian was once again ruling Egypt. The Second Intermediate Period was characterized by invasion from the outside. The Hyksos came down into Egypt from the Levant to rule at Avaris, and the Nubians came up north, pushing into Egypt. In the middle, Theban power slowly began to grow until it was strong enough to rival both of these groups. But while textual sources often depict this as a time of chaos, and undoubtedly there certainly was some political turmoil, there were also a number of technological, economic, and artistic developments that continued throughout this era. One need only look at the golden dagger or the royal ceremonial battle axe to see complex and sophisticated culture persisted during this time. So when you think about something like the Intermediate Period, make sure you look at it from a well-rounded viewpoint, not just that of the kings and queens at the very top of the socioeconomic hierarchy. These are just a couple of the lessons you can learn from the Second Intermediate Period.